On the first day of September 1939, as German panzers crossed into Poland and Europe fell into its second Great War in a generation, the United States Navy counted 408 warships in commission or under construction. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, gunboats on Chinese rivers, patrol yachts, minesweepers left over from the last war. On paper, one of the largest fleets on Earth. In reality, a navy that a democracy had built slowly, reluctantly, one appropriations bill at a time, while the world burned around it. This is the story of that fleet. Every class of warship the United States Navy owned on the day the Second World War began. The ships that were ready, the ships that were obsolete, the ships still on the building ways, and a strange, uneven shape of a naval power that knew another war was coming but could not quite convince itself to prepare for it. To understand the United States Navy of September 1939, you have to understand what kind of country built it. America was, by any measure that mattered, the greatest industrial power on Earth. Her steel mills outproduced Britain and Germany combined. Her shipyards, from Bath in Maine to Mare Island in California, sat with capacity to spare. Her engineers had drawings ready for battleships, carriers, and cruisers that could outfight anything afloat. But America was also a democracy, and a democracy deep in the shadow of the Great Depression. Every warship had to be argued for in Congress. Every dollar spent on a destroyer was a dollar not spent on a bridge, a schoolhouse, a relief check for a family in Oklahoma. The American public, in the summer of 1939, wanted no part of another European war. They remembered the last one. They remembered the bodies that came home from the Argonne, the broken promises of Versailles, the Nye committee hearings that had declared the whole adventure a racket run by bankers and arms dealers. Neutrality was the law of the land, written into 4 separate acts of Congress. Isolationism was not a fringe position. It was the mainstream, so when the Navy asked for ships, the Navy had to ask politely. It had to dress up new construction as economic stimulus, as the Vincent Trammell Act had done in 1934, pushing naval building programs through as part of the New Deal recovery. It had to pretend, sometimes, that a battleship was really a jobs program. And when the treaties ran out, when Japan walked away from the Washington and London naval agreements, the Navy still had to move carefully, because the American voter was watching. The result was the fleet that existed on the 1st of September 1939, a fleet with deep roots in the First World War, a fleet whose last completed battleship had entered service in 1923, a fleet with 6 aircraft carriers and a doctrine for using them that almost nobody outside the service took seriously, a fleet of 70 submarines, most of them too short-ranged for the ocean they would have to fight in, a fleet of 136 destroyers, nearly half of them flush-deck veterans of the last war, rusting at anchor in San Diego and Philadelphia. At the top of this fleet sat Admiral Harold Rainsford Stark, who had taken over as Chief of Naval Operations exactly 1 month earlier. On the 1st of August, the job of Secretary of the Navy was vacant. Claude Swanson, the previous secretary, had died in office in July. Charles Edison, the son of Thomas Edison, was running the department as acting secretary and would not be formally confirmed until January. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had himself served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the last war, took a personal interest in fleet matters, sometimes to the frustration of his admirals. On the day Germany invaded Poland, Roosevelt did not declare war. He could not, but in the Navy Department, plans that had been prepared for months were about to move. Within 4 days, on the 4th of September, the Chief of Naval Operations would order the Atlantic Squadron to establish a combined air and sea patrol along the Atlantic coast and through the Caribbean, watching for belligerent warships in American waters. The next day, the 5th of September, Roosevelt would proclaim American neutrality and declare the naval patrol a neutrality patrol. The expanded hemispheric security zone, 300 miles out to sea, would be formalized by the American republics at Panama in October. It was a fig leaf. Everyone in the fleet understood that the neutrality patrol was really an Atlantic picket line. built to keep the Kriegsmarine away from the American coast and to funnel intelligence to the British. This, then, is what the United States Navy looked like on the morning of September 1st, 1939. 408 ships, spread across 2 oceans and a dozen overseas stations. A sleeping giant, if you want to use the phrase that would become famous a little over 2 years later. But the giant was not asleep by accident. The giant was asleep because the American people had voted again and again to keep him that way. Now the ships themselves. We begin with the heaviest, the oldest, the most symbolic, the battleships. The battleship, in September 1939, was still the measure of naval power. Every major fleet in the world was counted first by its dreadnoughts, and the United States Navy had 15 of them in commission, with 4 more on the building ways. 19 battleships, divided into 9 classes, spanning 27 years of naval architecture. Some of them had been built before the First World War. The newest had been commissioned in 1923, and then, for 16 years, the United States had not completed a single battleship. That gap, that long silence in American battleship construction, is not an accident. It is the single most important fact about the American fleet of 1939, and it explains almost everything else you are about to see. The oldest battleship in the fleet was USS Wyoming, commissioned in 1912. She and her sister ship, Arkansas, made up the Wyoming class. By 1939, Wyoming herself had been demilitarized in 1931, stripped of half her 12-inch guns under the terms of the London Naval Treaty and reduced to a training ship. She had become a schoolhouse for gunners and midshipmen, her decks worn smooth by the boots of men who would go on to fight the next war in newer hulls. Arkansas had kept her full armament and still served as a combatant. The London Treaty had done this to Wyoming. The United States had signed it. A democracy had agreed to cut up its own battleship on paper to keep a naval arms race from breaking out. Wyoming was the physical evidence of that agreement. Next came the New York class, 2 ships, USS New York and USS Texas. Commissioned in 1914, these were the first American battleships with 14-inch guns, 10 of them in 5 twin turrets, and they were the last American battleships with reciprocating steam engines rather than turbines. They were, by 1939, genuinely old, but they had been modernized twice, given new boilers, new tripod masts, new fire control, and they were still frontline ships. Texas is the one you can visit today. Moored outside Houston, the last surviving dreadnought in the world. In 1939, she was 25 years old and still in the battle line. The Nevada class, USS Nevada and USS Oklahoma, commissioned in 1916, introduced something revolutionary in American battleship design. Their armor was arranged on what the Bureau of Construction and Repair called the all-or-nothing principle. Instead of spreading thin armor over the whole ship, designers concentrated thick armor only around the vital spaces, the magazines, the engine rooms, the conning tower, and left the rest of the hull essentially unarmored. The logic was brutal and correct. At the long ranges that modern gunnery made possible, thin armor stopped nothing. Either you had enough armor to resist a 14-inch shell, or you had none at all. Every battleship built anywhere in the world for the next 30 years would copy this principle. Nevada and Oklahoma were where it began. The Pennsylvania class, USS Pennsylvania and USS Arizona, commissioned in 1916, were bigger refinements of the Nevada concept. 12 14-inch guns instead of 10, arranged in 4 triple turrets. Pennsylvania was the flagship of the United States fleet. She flew the 4-star flag of Admiral Claude Bloch, Commander-in-Chief of the fleet, from her foremast. Arizona was her sister, her near-identical twin, and in 1939 she was moored at San Pedro, California, one of the most photographed battleships in the Navy. The two ships had been modernized in the late 20s, given new tripod masts, new anti-aircraft guns, new fire control directors. They looked, from a distance, almost modern. They were not. The New Mexico class, 3 ships, USS New Mexico, USS Mississippi, and USS Idaho, commissioned in 1918, were the first American battleships built with turbo-electric drive. Instead of connecting the turbines directly to the propeller shafts, the turbines drove electrical generators which powered electric motors which turned the shafts. It was an unusual choice, and it made the ships heavy and complicated, but it also made them extraordinarily efficient at low cruising speeds. The New Mexicos had been rebuilt from the keel up in the early 1930s, given new engines, new armor, new superstructures. They looked almost nothing like they had looked at commissioning. They were, arguably, the most thoroughly modernized battleships in the fleet. The Tennessee class, USS Tennessee and USS California, commissioned in 1920, were refinements of the New Mexico design. Same turbo-electric drive, same 12 14-inch guns, but now in 4 triple turrets with superior fire control. California was the flagship of the battle force, which meant she carried the 3-star flag of Vice Admiral Adolphus Andrews. Tennessee was her sister. Both ships had the distinctive American battleship silhouette of the interwar period, with the enormous tripod masts that the service called fire control towers, tall as office buildings, crawling with directors and spotters and rangefinders. The Colorado class, commissioned between 1921 and 1923, were the last American battleships completed before the Long Silence. There were 3 of them: USS Colorado, USS Maryland, and USS West Virginia. A 4th sister, USS Washington, had been cancelled in 1922, 75% complete, and used as a gunnery target. The cancellation was required by the Washington Naval Treaty, signed in February of that year. The Colorados carried 8 16-inch guns, 2 fewer than the 14-inch Tennessees, but each shell weighing half again as much. They were the first American battleships to carry the 16-inch gun. They were also, for the next 18 years, the last. Maryland was the flagship of Admiral Edward Calfus, commanding Battleship Division 4. These 3 ships, plus the 6 Tennessees, Pennsylvanias, and Nevadas behind them, represented the concentrated striking power of the United States fleet. The Big Five, as naval officers called the 3 Colorados and the 2 Tennessees, were the most powerful ships in the American Navy. And then, silence. From 1923 until 1937, the United States Navy laid down no battleships. None. 16 years without a new dreadnought completed, 14 years without a new one even begun. The Washington Naval Treaty had frozen battleship construction, yes, but the treaty had allowed replacements for ships that had grown too old, and the United States had chosen not to build them. There was no money. There was no political will. The Great Depression had arrived in 1929, and every dollar spent on a battleship was a dollar the American public did not want spent. The Navy sent its battleship designers to work on other projects. Some of them designed cruisers. Some of them designed merchant ships. Some of them retired. The Bureau of Construction and Repair kept its drafting tables warm and waited. The waiting ended in 1937. The Second London Naval Treaty, signed the year before, had allowed battleship construction to resume with certain limits: 14-inch guns and 35,000 tons displacement. The United States laid down 2 ships to those limits: USS North Carolina and USS Washington, the North Carolina class. But Japan refused to sign the treaty, and when the escalator clauses were triggered, the North Carolinas were rearmed during construction with 9 16-inch guns. They would not be commissioned until 1941. On September 1, 1939, they were steel skeletons on the building, ways at New York Navy Yard and Philadelphia Navy Yard, framed out but not yet launched. Behind them, 2 more ships, USS South Dakota and USS Massachusetts, the first pair of the South Dakota class, had been laid down in July of 1939, just weeks before the German invasion of Poland. Two more South Dakotas, USS Indiana and USS Alabama, would be laid down within months. The South Dakotas were designed to the same 35,000-ton limit as the North Carolinas, but squeezed into a shorter, more compact hull, with the armored citadel tightened and the weight savings put into heavier armor. They would not be commissioned until 1942. On the day the war began in Europe, they were barely more than keel plates. This was the American battleship fleet, 15 ships in commission, every one of them at least 16 years old, 4 ships under construction, none of them less than 2 years from completion. Ranged against them, on the other side of the world, the Imperial Japanese Navy had 10 battleships in commission, 2 modern battlecruisers and 2 super battleships secretly under construction at Kure and Nagasaki that would displace 70,000 tons and carry 18-inch guns. The Americans did not know this. The Japanese had taken extraordinary measures to conceal the Yamato program, and the intelligence failure was nearly complete. What the Americans did know was that their own battle line was old. Admiral Stark knew it. Admiral Block knew it. The men who stood watch on the bridges of Pennsylvania and California and West Virginia knew it. They also knew that the first of the new ships was still 2 years away. In the meantime, they would make do with what they had. 15 dreadnoughts, modernized, cherished, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. From the battleships, which could shoot farther than any gun had ever shot, we turned to a different kind of ship. A ship that carried no main battery worth mentioning, that moved aircraft instead of shells, and that almost nobody in September 1939 believed was the future: the aircraft carriers. In September 1939, the United States Navy owned 6 aircraft carriers, 5 in commission, 1 under construction, divided into 4 classes. By the standards of what would come later, it was a tiny force. By the standards of the rest of the world, it was the largest carrier fleet on Earth. The Royal Navy had 7 carriers, but most of them were First World War conversions, small and slow. The Imperial Japanese Navy had 6, and theirs were better. The French had 1. The Germans had none. The Italians had none. Nobody else had any at all. And yet, in September 1939, almost no senior officer in the United States Navy believed that the aircraft carrier would decide the next war. The battleship men were in charge. The Gun Club, as the carrier advocates called them, controlled the promotions, the war plans, and the Naval War College. Carriers were scouts. Carriers were raiders. Carriers were interesting experiments. A few officers, a very few, thought they were something more. They were mostly wrong about the details and mostly right about the direction, and they were almost all named in this chapter. The first real American carriers, the ones that defined the type for 2 decades, were the Lexington class. USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, commissioned in 1927. They were enormous ships, almost 900 feet long, displacing 36,000 tons. They were also accidents. The Lexingtons had been laid down in 1920 and 1921 as battle cruisers, part of a planned class of 6, designed to chase down Japanese battle cruisers across the Pacific. When the Washington Naval Treaty canceled the battle cruiser program in 1922, the United States was left with 2 enormous hulls, already half-built, and a treaty loophole that permitted the conversion of capital ship hulls into aircraft carriers up to a combined tonnage of 66,000 tons. The Navy poured the Lexingtons into that loophole. What came out was a pair of carriers, so large, so fast, so heavily built that they dominated the carrier force for the next 15 years. The Lexingtons carried something no other American carrier would ever carry: 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward of the island and 2 aft. The guns were a hedge. If the aircraft doctrine failed, If the carrier turned out to be useless, the Navy wanted to be able to use these ships as surface combatants. The guns were heavier than the main battery of a light cruiser. They were almost never used. By September 1939, the doctrine had proved itself, at least within the service, and the 8-inch guns were increasingly seen as dead weight. They would be removed during the war. The Lexingtons were where the United States Navy learned how to operate carriers. In the annual fleet exercises of the 1920s and 30s, Lexington and Saratoga launched strike after strike against defended positions. In Fleet Problem 9 in 1929, Saratoga slipped away from the battle fleet under the command of Rear Admiral Joseph Mason Reeves, ran north at 30 knots under cover of darkness, and launched a simulated dawn attack on the Panama Canal. The attack was ruled a complete success. The umpires called it unrealistic. Reeves, who would go on to become Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, was called the father of American carrier aviation by the men who served under him. He had taken command of the carriers in 1925, and what he had done with Lexington and Saratoga in those exercises would be remembered at Pearl Harbor 12 years later by an officer named Isoroku Yamamoto, who had attended Harvard and read every American fleet exercise report he could get his hands on. After the Lexingtons came the mistake. USS Ranger, commissioned in 1934, was the first American ship designed from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. The Navy had been given a treaty tonnage allowance, and the decision was made to spread it across as many hulls as possible. Rather than build 2 more Lexingtons, the Navy built one smaller carrier, cheaper, lighter, with weaker machinery and thinner armor. Ranger displaced 14,500 tons, less than half the size of Lexington. She made 29 knots, 4 knots slower than a Lexington. She had no real armor belt. Her flight deck was narrow and her hangar was cramped. Ranger carried about the same number of aircraft as Lexington on paper, but in practice she could not launch them as quickly, could not recover them in heavy weather, and could not survive battle damage. The Navy took one look at Ranger and decided not to build any more. She spent most of her career in the Atlantic, where the weather was worse, but the threat was lighter. Her career was respectable but unglamorous. She was never modernized. She never served in the Pacific during the war. She was, by every measure, the aircraft carrier the Navy did not want, and she was a useful lesson in what a treaty-constrained carrier should not be. The lesson produced the Yorktown class. USS Yorktown, commissioned in 1937, and USS Enterprise, commissioned in 1938. These were the ships the Ranger should have been: 20,000 tons, 824 feet long, 32.5 knots, 80 to 90 aircraft, a real armor belt, proper compartmentation, good damage control. The Yorktowns were, by the standards of 1939, the best carriers in the world. They were not as large as the Lexingtons, but they were better designed, better compromised, better ships. Enterprise in particular would become the most famous carrier in American naval history. In September 1939, she was 1 year old, operating out of Norfolk under Captain Newton White. She carried Fighting Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6, and Bombing Squadron 6 and Torpedo Squadron 6. She had just transferred from the Pacific Fleet for a brief Atlantic deployment before returning west. Her pilots were learning the trade that almost nobody in the Navy yet took seriously. The Yorktowns were built under the leadership of Rear Admiral Ernest King, who had commanded the Bureau of Aeronautics from 1933 to 1936. King was a difficult man, feared by his subordinates, disliked by his peers, respected grudgingly by his superiors. He had come to aviation late in his career. At the age of 48, he had earned his pilot's wings because the law required the Bureau of Aeronautics to be headed by a qualified aviator, and King was willing to do what was required to get the job. He was not a natural pilot. He was a natural administrator, and the Yorktown class was the physical product of his 3 years at the Bureau. The last American carrier in commission or under construction on September 1, 1939, was USS Wasp. She was fitting out at Bethlehem Shipbuilding in Quincy, Massachusetts, and would be commissioned in April 1940. Wasp was, like Ranger, a treaty compromise. The Washington and London treaties had allocated a total of 135,000 tons to American carriers, and after Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, and Enterprise were built, there were 14,700 tons left over. Wasp was what you could build with the remainder. She was small, she was unarmored, she was slower than Yorktown and more fragile than Ranger. She carried the same number of aircraft as a Yorktown, but without any of the protection. The Navy knew she was a weak ship and built her anyway, because the alternative was to leave the tonnage on the table, and the treaty was about to expire in any case. When Japan withdrew from the naval limitations in 1936, the Navy was already committed to Wasp. She was finished as drawn. Wasp's most visible innovation was the deck edge elevator, mounted on the port side of the flight deck rather than cut into it. The elevator saved hull volume and allowed a longer hangar. It would become the standard arrangement for all American carriers built after the war. In that one detail, Wasp was a glimpse of the future. In every other respect, she was a ship the Navy had agreed to build because it had no better option. Behind these 5 commissioned ships, one more carrier was coming. USS Hornet, the 3rd ship of the Yorktown class, would be laid down at Newport News later in September 1939, the very month the war began in Europe. She would not be commissioned until October 1941, 7 weeks before Pearl Harbor. On September 1st, her keel plates were being cut, but not yet laid down, her existence planned and funded, but not yet physical. And beyond Hornet, nothing. No other carriers were under construction, authorized, or even seriously planned. The first of the Essex class, the ships that would dominate the Pacific, would not be laid down until April 1941. In September 1939, the carrier force stood at 6 ships, 5 in service and 1 nearly complete, and no more behind them. The entire future of American carrier aviation, every fleet action at Coral Sea and Midway and the Philippine Sea, would be fought with these 6 hulls plus Hornet, until the Essex class began to arrive in 1943. The men who commanded these carriers in September 1939 had names that would soon be famous. Vice Admiral Adolphus Andrews commanded the scouting force, which included the Atlantic carriers. Rear Admiral Charles Blakely commanded aircraft. Battle Force, flying his flag from Lexington. The carriers were administratively subordinate to the battle line. Nobody in September 1939 had any idea that within 3 years, those flag assignments would be reversed, and the carrier would dictate the movements of the battleship. From the big ships, the capital ships, we moved to the next category, the cruisers. The ships that had been designed to scout, to screen, to raid. Ships whose mission was clearest in peacetime and whose role in the war that was coming was still, in September 1939, a matter of intense debate. The heavy cruiser was, more than any other warship type of the interwar period, a creature of arms control. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had set a limit of 10,000 tons and 8-inch guns on cruiser construction, and had given the major naval powers permission to build as many ships to that limit as they wished. The formal distinction between heavy and light cruisers came later, in the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which drew the line at 8-inch guns. Anything larger than 6 inches was a heavy cruiser. Anything 6 inches or less, a light cruiser. Together, these treaties had shaped a new category of warship, and the navies of the world had spent the next 15 years trying to figure out what to do with it. The United States built 18 heavy cruisers between 1924 and 1939. They fell into 5 classes, and the evolution of those classes is the evolution of American cruiser design under the constant pressure of treaty limits. Each class was better than the one before it, and each class was still, fundamentally, a 10,000-ton 8-inch ship, because the treaty would not let it be anything else. The first American heavy cruisers were USS Pensacola and USS Salt Lake City, the Pensacola class, commissioned in 1929 and 1929. They were, by the standards of what came later, lightly built and poorly armored. Their designers had been given an impossible problem: build a cruiser to 10,000 tons that could carry 10 8-inch guns, make 32 knots, and cross the Pacific without refueling. Something had to give, and what gave was the armor. Pensacola and Salt Lake City were sometimes called the tin-clad cruisers because their belt armor was only 4 inches thick, thinner than the armor of many destroyers. A single hit from an 8-inch shell could penetrate their vitals. They were fast and well-armed and fragile. They were also unusual in their gun arrangement. 10 8-inch guns in 2 triple turrets and 2 twin turrets, with the triples mounted above the twins. This arrangement, heavy guns high and lighter guns low, was the opposite of standard practice and made the ships top-heavy. They rolled badly in any kind of sea. Naval architects treated them as a cautionary tale for decades afterward, but they were the first, and they taught the Bureau of Construction and Repair what not to do. The Northampton class, 6 ships commissioned in 1930 and 1931, fixed some of the Pensacola problems. The guns were rearranged into 3 triple turrets in a more conventional layout. The hull was lengthened by 15 feet. The machinery was rearranged. USS Northampton, USS Chester, USS Louisville, USS Chicago, USS Houston, and USS Augusta made up the class. Houston and Augusta were built with additional flag accommodations because they were designed to serve as flagships. Augusta, in particular, had a special cabin for the use of the President of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt used it more than once, sailing to his meetings at Argentia Bay and later at Quebec. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy from 1913 to 1920. He knew his way around a cruiser. Houston was the President's other favorite. Roosevelt had taken her on a long inspection cruise of the Pacific in 1938, visiting Pearl Harbor, Samoa, and the Galapagos. She was commanded in September 1939 by Captain Jesse Oldendorf, an officer who would become famous 5 years later for crossing the T of a Japanese battle line in Surigao Strait. Oldendorf was not yet a flag officer. He was a cruiser captain, and his ship was moored at Cavite in the Philippines, part of the Asiatic Fleet under Admiral Thomas Hart. The Northamptons still had thin armor. They were still, in technical terms, treaty cruisers, but they were better ships than the Pensacola's, and they formed the backbone of the heavy cruiser force in the middle 30s. The Portland class was a small one, only 2 ships, USS Portland and USS Indianapolis, commissioned in 1932 and 1932. They were, in most respects, improved Northamptons, slightly larger, slightly better armored, 5 inches of belt armor instead of 3 3/4, 9 8-inch guns in the same 3 triple turret arrangement. Portland was the name ship. Indianapolis was the more famous of the two because Indianapolis was also designed to carry a flag, and she carried it with distinction. President Roosevelt sailed in her as well. In 1936, she took him on a good neighbor tour of South America, visiting Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. The Indianapolis was the 3rd presidential cruiser after Houston and Augusta, and she had the same reputation for comfort. Both Portland and Indianapolis were commanded in September 1939 by officers who had come up through the cruiser force, the scouting force, the reconnaissance arm of the battle fleet. Portland's war would come later. Indianapolis would become, after long service and many honors, the worst single-ship loss in United States Navy history, sunk by a Japanese submarine in July 1945, with nearly 900 of her crew dying in the water. None of that was known or knowable in September 39. She was a good cruiser. She was a presidential favorite. She was on routine duty. The New Orleans class was the masterpiece of American treaty cruiser design. 7 ships commissioned between 1934 and 1937. USS New Orleans, USS Astoria, USS Minneapolis, USS Tuscaloosa, USS Pinnacle, USS Tuscaloosa, USS San Francisco, USS Pincy, and USS Vincennes. The designers had finally learned how to make a 10,000-ton cruiser with a 5-inch belt and 9 8-inch guns without sacrificing speed or seakeeping. The trick had been in the details: shorter hull, better internal arrangement, heavier framing, revised machinery spaces. The New Orleans class looked externally like improved Northamptons. Internally, they were different ships. They were the last American cruisers to be designed under the 10,000-ton limit, and they represented the absolute ceiling of what that displacement could produce. Astoria had carried the ashes of the former Japanese ambassador to the United States, Hiroshi Saito, home to Japan in 1939 in a ceremonial gesture of goodwill that had been extensively photographed by Japanese newspapers. The photographs had included detailed shots of Astoria's superstructure, her fire control, and her armament arrangement. In September 1939, those photographs were still fresh. Japanese naval intelligence had a complete set. San Francisco was the flagship of Rear Admiral Herbert Leary, commanding Cruiser Division 6. Vincennes, Quincy, and Tuscaloosa were in the Atlantic, assigned to the Neutrality Patrol. The New Orleans class was spread across both oceans, doing exactly what the treaty cruiser had been invented to do: showing the flag, protecting American merchant shipping, scouting ahead of the battle fleet. And then, one ship, standing alone, USS Wichita, commissioned in February 1939, 7 months before the war began. She was a single ship of her class. There would be no sister. Wichita was the bridge between the treaty cruisers and the post-war cruisers, between the 10,000-ton straitjacket and the heavy ships that would follow. Wichita had been built on the hull of a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, which you will meet in the next section, but with 9 8-inch guns mounted in 3 triple turrets instead of 15 6-inch guns in 5 triples. Her armor was thicker than any previous American heavy cruiser, 6 4/10 inches on the belt. Her displacement was about 10,500 tons, just over the treaty limit, because by the time she was designed, the treaty was dying and the Navy had decided to break it quietly. She was the prototype for the Baltimore class, the heavy cruisers that would be built by the dozen during the war, but none of that had happened yet. In September 1939, Wichita was a single experimental cruiser working up in the Atlantic, the testbed for what American heavy cruiser design would look like when the treaties were finally gone. 18 heavy cruisers, 5 classes, each one better than the one before, and each one still marked by the fingerprints of the arms control agreements that had created the type in the first place. The American heavy cruiser force in September 39 was larger than the Japanese heavy cruiser force. It was the second largest in the world, behind only the British. It was a considerable fleet. It was also a fleet designed for the last peace, not the next war. Cruisers had been built to scout for battleships. Nobody had quite figured out, yet, what they would actually do when the war came. Behind the heavy cruisers stood a larger, older, more varied force. The light cruisers, ships that had been building for longer in more shapes, serving more purposes, and in September 1939, still included 10 hulls that had been designed during the First World War. The light cruiser, unlike the heavy cruiser, was an old type. It had existed before the treaties. It had existed before the First World War. It was the descendant of the protected cruiser, the scout cruiser, the unarmored cruiser of the 19th century. By the terms of the naval treaties, a light cruiser was any cruiser whose main battery was 6 inches or less and whose displacement did not exceed 10,000 tons. Below that threshold, the light cruiser was treated as a separate category with its own tonnage allowance. The United States Navy in September 1939 owned 19 light cruisers in 3 classes. 10 of them had been designed during the First World War. 7 of them had been designed to counter a specific Japanese threat. 2 of them were brand new, completed the year the war broke out in Europe. The light cruiser force of 1939 is, in many ways, the clearest picture of the transition that was happening inside the American fleet. The old ships and the new ships, side by side, doing the same jobs with very different tools. The Omaha class is the clearest survival of the First World War in the American fleet of 1939. 10 ships, all of them commissioned between 1923 and 1925, but designed in 1925, but designed in 1916 and 1917 as scout cruisers for the North Sea. USS Omaha, USS Milwaukee, USS Cincinnati, USS Raleigh, USS Detroit, USS Richmond, USS Concord, USS Trenton, USS Marblehead, and USS Memphis. They were long, narrow, four-funneled ships that looked like scaled-up destroyers. They had been designed to make 35 knots, faster than any cruiser then afloat, because their job was to run ahead of the battle fleet and find the enemy. Their armament was eccentric, 12 6-inch guns, but arranged in the old casemate fashion, with guns mounted in armored boxes along the sides of the hull, plus twin turrets forward and aft. This was the pre-Jutland arrangement, designed for broadside fire, and it was already obsolete when the ships were completed. The side guns could not be trained far enough to fire ahead or astern, and in any kind of seaway they took water through their mountings. The Omahas were, by 1939, clearly second-line ships. But there were 10 of them, and the Navy could not afford to scrap working hulls. They were scattered across the fleet, assigned to every overseas station that needed a cruiser. Marblehead was in the Asiatic fleet at Cavite. Trenton and Memphis were in the Caribbean. Milwaukee and Cincinnati were in the Atlantic, running neutrality patrol sweeps. Richmond was at Pearl Harbor. They were the workhorses of the light cruiser force, not because anyone thought they were first-rate, but because they existed, and they floated, and they could steam at 25 knots for weeks on end. The Brooklyn class was the American answer to a specific Japanese provocation. In 1934, Japan had laid down the first ships of the Megami class, advertised as light cruisers of 8,500 tons with 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets. On paper, this was within the London Treaty limits. In practice, the Megamines, displaced closer to 11,000 tons, were dangerously top-heavy and were designed to be rearmed with 8-inch guns as soon as the treaty lapsed. The Japanese had built heavy cruisers under the light cruiser allowance, and they had done it openly, daring the other treaty powers to call them on it. The American response was to build the same ship. 7 hulls of the Brooklyn class, commissioned between 1937 and 1939. USS Brooklyn, USS Philadelphia, USS Savannah, USS Nashville, USS Phoenix, USS Boise, and USS Honolulu. Each one displacing about 9,700 tons, carrying 15 6-inch guns in 5 triple turrets capable of 32.5 knots. They were, by almost any measure, the best light cruisers in the world. Their 15-gun broadside could put out a volume of fire that no 8-inch cruiser could match at close range. Their armor was thicker than most heavy cruisers of the same generation. They were fast, they were well protected, and they were numerous. Phoenix was at Pearl Harbor in September 1939. Boise was at San Pedro. Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Savannah were in the Atlantic. Nashville was working up with the Neutrality Patrol. Honolulu was at Pearl Harbor as well. The Brooklyns were the first American cruisers built with aviation facilities integrated into the hull, with a hangar under the main deck aft and catapults for floatplanes. They looked, from a distance, like smaller heavy cruisers. They were, in most respects, more useful ships than the heavy cruisers they resembled. The St. Louis class was a Brooklyn with better engines. 2 ships, USS St. Witomusco, Louis, and USS Helena, both in the final stages of completion in early September 1939. St. Louis had been commissioned in May. Helena would follow her into commission on the 18th of September, 17 days after the war began in Europe. They carried the same 15 6-inch guns as the Brooklyns, the same armor, the same speed. What had changed was internal. The Brooklyns had used a conventional machinery layout with all 4 boiler rooms forward of the engine rooms. The St. Edmund Louis class introduced alternating machinery spaces, what the Navy called unit construction, with boilers and engines staggered along the hull so that a single torpedo hit could not disable both sets of machinery at once. This was not a minor change. It was the beginning of a philosophy of damage control that would dominate American warship design for the rest of the war. The St. Louis and Helena were the prototypes. Every cruiser, destroyer and battleship built afterward would use the same principle. On September 1st, 1939, St. Louis was at Pearl Harbor. Helena was fitting out at New York Navy Yard. Neither ship had fired a shot in anger. The lessons they carried in their engine room layouts were still theoretical. Within 3 years, they would be among the most important lessons in the fleet. 19 light cruisers, 3 classes, 2 generations. The Omahas, old and eccentric, doing the patrol work that nobody wanted. The Brooklyns and St. Louis's, modern and powerful, waiting for the war that was coming. Between them, the light cruiser force spanned the entire transition of the American Navy from the First World War to the Second. And that brings us to the destroyers. 136 of them, scattered across 12 classes, spanning 20 years of design and making up by far the largest single category of warship in the American fleet. There are more destroyers to describe than there are battleships, carriers, and cruisers combined. So we begin where American destroyer history begins, in its recognizably modern form, at the end of the First World War, with the flush-deck ships. The destroyer was the busiest type in the United States Navy. 136 of them in 12 classes, spanning the 20 years between the end of the First World War and the first day of the Second. They screened the battle line. They escorted convoys. They hunted submarines. They launched torpedoes. They carried admirals' flags when the admirals were in a hurry. In September 1939, they made up exactly 1/3 of every commissioned warship in the fleet. And like the rest of the Navy, they fell into 2 clear generations. The ships built at the end of the last war, and the ships built in the decade before this one. The Wickes class was the first of the flush-deckers, the ships the Navy called 4 pipers because of their 4 tall funnels, and the ship's history remembers as the destroyers that nearly broke the American shipbuilding industry. The United States Navy ordered 111 Wickes-class destroyers between 1917 and 1919 in a wartime production program that rivaled anything the country had ever attempted. The ships were flush-decked, meaning their main deck ran uninterrupted from bow to stern, a design choice that saved weight and simplified construction. They carried 4 4-inch guns and 12 21-inch torpedo tubes. They could make 35 knots. They were, by the standards of 1918, modern destroyers. By the standards of 1939, they were 20 years old and showing every year of it. The Navy had retained 16 Wickes-class ships in active service, scattered across squadrons in the Atlantic and the Pacific. The rest had been decommissioned and laid up in reserve fleets at Philadelphia, at San Diego, and at Charleston, mothballed with red lead paint over their turbines, waiting. The Navy had too many of them. The Navy could not bring itself to scrap them. Within a year, Franklin Roosevelt would give 50 of the mothballed Wickes and Clemkinson class to the British in the Destroyers for Bases agreement, and the 4 pipers would fight the Battle of the Atlantic under the White Ensign. That was in the future. In September 39, 16 Wickes-class ships still wore American colors, doing convoy screen work and neutrality patrols in hulls that had been launched during the Wilson administration. The Plemson class was a slightly improved Wickes with larger fuel tanks, better range, and a reinforced hull. 156 of them were built between 1919 and 1922, the largest single class of destroyers ever completed by any navy in the world. Combined with the Wickes class and the earlier Caldwell prototypes, the flush deck program as a whole produced over 260 destroyers. It was a staggering production number, achieved by a country that had entered the war with fewer than 40 destroyers in commission and emerged from it as the largest destroyer-building nation on Earth. The Navy paid for that achievement for the next 2 decades. 32 Clemson-class destroyers remained in active service in September 1939. The rest were decommissioned, scrapped, sold, or converted to other uses. 15 Clemsons had been rebuilt as fast destroyer transports, with 2 of their 4 boilers removed to make room for troop accommodations and assigned to the Marine Corps. Others had been converted into light mine layers, which you will meet in a later section. The Clemsons, like the Wicks, were the ships the Navy could not stop having. They existed in such numbers that they defined what a destroyer looked like in the American service for an entire generation. The most important consequence of the flush deck program was the long pause that followed. The United States Navy laid down no new destroyers between 1920 and 1932. 12 full years of silence in destroyer construction. There was no point. The Navy had more destroyers than it knew what to do with. The Washington and London treaties had limited destroyer tonnage as well, and the United States was already over its limit from the flush deck program, so the Bureau of Construction and Repair turned its destroyer designers to other tasks. And the country that had built more destroyers than anyone else in history built no destroyers at all for 12 years. The silence ended with the Farragut class. 8 ships commissioned in 1934 and 1935, the first new destroyers in American service in over a decade. They were named after 19th-century naval heroes, and the name ship carried a name that every American naval officer knew: David Glasgow Farragut, the admiral who had stood lashed to the rigging of USS Hartford at Mobile Bay in 1864 and shouted the order that entered every American naval lexicon: "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead." Farragut had been the Navy's first full admiral. He had died in 1870. His name, 64 years later, christened the ship that began the modern American destroyer force. The Farragut class was a different animal from the flushdeckers. She had a raised forecastle instead of a flush deck, which made her much drier in a headsea. She carried 5 5-inch guns instead of 4 4-inch, and the 5-inch guns were dual-purpose, able to engage both surface targets and aircraft. She had only 8 torpedo tubes instead of 12, a conscious trade-off in favor of gun armament. She made 36.5 knots. She displaced 1,365 tons, about 200 tons more than a Clemson. The Farragut class introduced almost every feature that would define American destroyer design for the next decade: unit machinery, alternating boiler and engine rooms, dual-purpose main battery, proper aft superstructure, modern fire control. The ships of the class were named USS Farragut, USS Dewey, USS Hull, USS McDonough, USS Worden, USS Dale, USS Monaghan, and USS Dale, USS Monaghan, and USS Aylwin. 6 of the 8 were at Pearl Harbor in September 1939, attached to Destroyer Squadron 1. They would still be there 2 years later. The Porter class was an experiment. 8 ships, commissioned in 1936 and 1937, designed as destroyer flotilla leaders, ships that would carry the flag of a destroyer squadron commander. They were larger than the Farraguts, 1,850 tons, 381 feet long, with 8 5-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. The 8-gun main battery was unusual. Most American destroyers carried their guns in single mountings. The Porters had enclosed twin turrets, which gave them better blast protection and a better arc of fire. The ships were named after officers of the American Sailing Navy. USS Porter for Commodore David Porter, who had commanded USS Essex in the War of 1812. USS Selfridge for Rear Admiral Thomas Oliver Selfridge. USS McDougal for Captain David Stockton McDougal, who had commanded USS Wyoming in the Chimanoski action of 1863. USS Winslow, USS Phelps, USS Plopes, USS Clark, USS Moffett, and USS Bouch. The class was named for Commodore Porter because his was the senior name. The ships were heavy and comfortable, and they served mostly as squadron flagships, which was what they had been built for. Within 3 years, their twin 5-inch turrets would prove to be insufficient against dive bombers, and the ships would be rebuilt with single dual-purpose mountings instead. The experiment had been partially successful. The Mahan class was the main production run of the 1934 naval program. 17 ships, built in parallel with the Porters, commissioned between 1936 and 1937. They were named USS Mahan, USS Cummings, USS Drayton, USS Lamson, USS Fusser, USS Reed, USS Case, USS Conyngham, USS Casson, USS Shaw, USS Tucker, USS Downs, USS Cushing, USS Spurston, and USS Dunlap. The named ship carried the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the naval theorist whose book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, had shaped the thinking of every modern navy in the world, including, it was said, the Imperial German Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy. Mahan himself had died in 1914. His ideas had outlived him. The irony of naming a destroyer for him was that Mahan had written about battleships, about the command of the sea by concentrated fleets of capital ships, and had treated destroyers as incidental. The named ship of his class was a ship of a type he had not considered important. That did not stop the Navy from naming her for him. The Mahan class introduced emergency diesel generators, improved torpedo fire control, and the 12-tube torpedo battery that would become standard on American destroyers for the next 5 years. 4 of the ships were stationed at Pearl Harbor. The rest were spread between the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. The Gridley class was a small class of 4 ships, a design variation on the Mahans. They traded one of the 5-inch guns for additional torpedo tubes, carrying 16 21-inch tubes in 4 quadruple mounts. This was the heaviest torpedo armament ever carried by an American destroyer, and it reflected a persistent debate inside the Bureau of Ordnance about whether American destroyers should fight with guns or with torpedoes. The Gridley side of the argument lost. After this class, American destroyers returned to 12-tube arrangements. The ships were USS Gridley, USS Grieven, USS McCall, and USS Maury. USS Gridley herself was named for Captain Charles Vernon Gridley, who had commanded USS Olympia at the Battle of Manila Bay in May 1898. Commodore George Dewey had stood next to Gridley on Olympia's bridge that morning and said the words that would appear in every schoolbook. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." Gridley had been a sick man at Manila Bay. He died of his illness 4 months later in Japan on his way home. The destroyer that carried his name 40 years later was a small 4-ship class operating in the Pacific under routine peacetime conditions. The Bagley class was essentially a parallel production of the Gridleys, 8 ships built to a similar torpedo-heavy design, but with somewhat different machinery. USS Bagley, USS Boo, USS Mugford, USS Ralph Talbot, USS Helm, USS Henley, USS Patterson, and USS Jarvis. The named ship was named for Ensign Worth Bagley, who had been killed aboard USS Winslow off Cardenas, Cuba in May 1898. Bagley was the first American naval officer killed in the Spanish-American War. He was 24 years old. A destroyer was named for him in the 1930s, and every time the ship's name was mentioned in a message or a ship's log, his memory was preserved. The Bagleys shared the same tactical weakness as the Gridleys. Too many torpedoes, not enough guns. They would be rebuilt during the war to carry more anti-aircraft weapons at the cost of some of the torpedo tubes. The Somers class was a second try at the flotilla leader concept, a 5-ship follow-on to the Porters. USS Somers, USS Warrington, USS Sampson, USS Davis, and USS Jewett They carried the same 8 5-inch guns in 4 twin turrets as the Porters, but with improved machinery and a single large funnel instead of 2, which gave them a distinctive silhouette. The lead ship was named for Master Commandant Richard Somers, who had been killed in 1804 in the attack on Tripoli Harbour against the Barbary pirates. His ketch Intrepid had exploded prematurely, killing Somers and 12 of his men. He was 25 years old. The destroyer carrying his name, 135 years later, served in the Atlantic on neutrality patrol. The Somers class was the last of the flotilla leader experiments. The Navy had built 13 of these larger destroyers, and experience showed that they were no more effective as flag units than standard destroyers with additional flag accommodations. No more flotilla leaders were built. The Somers and the Porters finished their careers as standard destroyer squadron ships, their leader function absorbed into the rest of the fleet. The Benham class, 10 ships commissioned in 1939, was the final evolution of the torpedo-heavy design. USS Benham, USS Ellet, USS Lang, USS Lang, USS Wilson, USS Stack, USS Starrett, USS Starrett, USS Marant, USS Tripp, USS Rind, and USS Rowan. They carried 16 torpedo tubes and 4 5-inch guns, the same armament as the Gridleys and Bagleys, but with a new high-pressure steam machinery plant that was significantly lighter and more efficient than anything that had come before. The weight savings were substantial. The same machinery would be used in every subsequent American destroyer class through the end of the war. The named ship was Rear Admiral Andrew Benham, who had commanded American naval forces in the Rio de Janeiro incident of 1894 and died in 1905. The choice of name was typical of the American system, in which destroyers carried the names of naval officers of the 19th century. Most of them now obscure to the general public, but remembered inside the service. Several of the Benham-class ships were in commission for less than 2 years before the war began in the Pacific. The Sims class marked the return to a 5-gun Maine battery, 12 ships commissioned in 1939 and 1940. USS Sims, USS Hughes, USS Anderson, USS Hughes, OSS Anderson, USS Hammond, USS Muston, USS Russell, USS O'Brien, USS Walk, USS Morris, USS Wainwright, and USS Buck. The class was named for Admiral William Soden Sims, who had commanded American naval forces operating from British bases during the First World War and who had written the most influential American naval memoir of the interwar period, The Victory at Sea, published in 1920. Sims had died in 1936, 3 years before his namesake was commissioned. He had been a reformer inside the Navy, a critic of naval bureaucracy, and an advocate for closer cooperation with the Royal Navy. His class of destroyers would take his philosophy of Anglo-American naval partnership literally. Several of them would be operating in British waters within 2 years, escorting convoys across the North Atlantic before the United States was formally at war. The Sims class returned to the 5-gun, 12-tube arrangement that the Farragut and Mahan classes had pioneered, closing a design debate that had consumed the Navy for the previous 5 years. The Benson-class ships were mostly not yet in commission on September 1, 1939. 6 of them were under construction at various yards: USS Benson, USS Mayo, USS Madison, USS Mayo, USS Hillary P. Jones, and USS Charles F. Hughes were the first of what would become a very large class of destroyers built in parallel with the related Gleaves class. The lead ship was named for Admiral William Shepard Benson, who had served as the first Chief of Naval Operations from 1915 to 1919. Benson had been a cautious, conservative officer who had opposed Sims's advocacy of close cooperation with the Royal Navy. The 2 men had disliked each other intensely. Now, in 1939, 2 destroyer classes were being built side by side, one named Sims, the other named Benson. The irony would have amused neither man. The Benson class introduced split funnel arrangements with 2 funnels separated by a wider distance than on previous classes, a visible sign of the alternating machinery layout that had become standard. They carried 10 torpedo tubes instead of 12 or 16, reflecting the post-Benham consensus that torpedo armament had been overemphasized. The design would become the basis for wartime mass production. Dozens more would be built in the coming years. The Gleaves class was the sister class to the Benson, built to a nearly identical design but by different yards using slightly different machinery. 10 ships of the class had been laid down by September 1, 1939, and none were yet in commission. USS Gleaves herself would be commissioned in June 1940. The lead ship was named for Admiral Albert Gleaves, who had commanded the cruiser and transport force that had carried the American expeditionary forces to France in 1917 and 1918, and who had died in 1937. The Benson and Gleaves classes together would be the transitional design between the pre-war destroyers and the wartime Fletcher class. They were, in September 1939, the future of the destroyer force, although none of them had yet joined the fleet. The pattern of American destroyer design was now set: 5 dual-purpose, 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, alternating machinery, 37 knots, 1,600 tons. That formula would be refined, but not fundamentally changed for the rest of the war. 136 destroyers, 48 of them built in 1918 and 1919, rusted veterans of the last war still in service because the Navy had built too many of them to let go. The other 88 were products of the 1934 naval program and the programs that followed it, the first real expansion of American destroyer construction since the armistice. The gap between them was 12 years. 12 years in which American destroyer designers had nothing to design. The ships they produced when the program resumed were good ships, some of them excellent, and together they formed the modern backbone of the American destroyer force. The flush-deckers would serve too. 50 of them would go to Britain within a year. The rest would patrol, escort convoys, train crews, and in some cases fight their way through the entire war. In September 1939, they were old, but they floated, and the Navy could not afford to be without them. Below the destroyers, invisible from the surface, the third great category of the American fleet was waiting. 70 submarines, spanning 21 years of design, divided between the short-range boats of the last war and the long-range fleet submarines that were just beginning to arrive. The submarines. The United States Navy in September 1939 owned 70 submarines in 9 classes spanning 21 years of American underwater design. More than half of them were obsolete. A third of them were experimental. The newest 10 had only just entered service, and they represented, at long last, the submarine the Navy had been trying to build for 2 decades. The history of the American submarine force between the wars is a history of a problem the Bureau of Construction and Repair could not seem to solve. How do you build a submarine that can cross the Pacific Ocean, scout for the battle fleet, and fight on its own in enemy waters? Every answer the Navy tried was wrong until the very last one. The R-class was the oldest submarine type still in American service in September 1939. 27 of them had been built between 1918 and 1919, and 6 remained in commission 2 decades later. They were small boats, 569 tons surfaced, 186 feet long, with 4 torpedo tubes and a single 3-inch gun. They had been designed as coastal submarines to defend the American coast against German U-boats that never came. By the standards of 1939, they were tiny, slow, and short-ranged. They were used for training, for harbor defense, and for the fleet's submarine schools. Most of their crews were students. The boats themselves were, in effect, floating classrooms. The S-class was the largest single class of submarines in the American fleet. 51 of them had been built between 1920 and 1925, and 26 remained in commission in September 1939. They were bigger than the R-class, 854 tons, 219 feet long. They carried the same 4 torpedo tubes, but a heavier 4-inch gun. They had been designed for open ocean operations, but they had been designed in 1919, and by the standards of the 1930s, they were cramped, slow to dive, and dangerous to operate. The S-class boats had been the Navy's standard submarine throughout the 1920s. They had been the ships that had taught a generation of American submarine officers how to handle a boat underwater. They had also been the ships that had killed more of those officers in accidents than any other type. USS 4 had been lost with all hands off Provincetown in 1927, rammed by a Coast Guard cutter on the surface and sunk in 100 feet of water. Her crew had tapped Morse code from inside the hull for 3 days while the Navy's rescue equipment failed to reach them. USS S-51 had been lost in 1925 in similar circumstances. The accidents had shaped everything about American submarine safety equipment that followed. The McCann Rescue Chamber, the submarine escape training at New London, the Mumsen lung-breathing apparatus, all of it came from the S-class disasters. In September 1939, the surviving S-boats were scattered across the fleet, with 6 of them attached to the Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines, where they were considered more expendable than the newer ships. They were old boats, but they were what the Navy had for the Pacific. Argonaut was a single ship, and she was nothing like anything else in the submarine force. Commissioned in 1928, she was the largest submarine in the United States Navy. 2,700 tons surfaced, 381 feet long. She had been built as a mine layer, carrying up to 60 mines in 2 stern tubes designed to lay them while submerged. She also carried 4 bow torpedo tubes and 2 6-inch deck guns, the heaviest gun armament ever mounted on an American submarine. Argonaut was an experiment in what a very large submarine might do. The experiment had not been a success. She was slow to dive, unwieldy on the surface, and her machinery was unreliable. Her mine-laying capability was rarely exercised in peacetime, because American naval doctrine had little interest in offensive mine-laying by submarines. She served through the 1930s as a training ship. An oddity, the sort of vessel that submariners described with a certain affection and a great deal of technical criticism. She would later be converted to a troop transport submarine during the war, and she would eventually be lost in the Pacific. In September 1939, she was based at Pearl Harbor, the flagship of Submarine Division 4. The Narwhal class was 2 ships, USS Narwhal and USS Nautilus, both commissioned in 1930. They were almost as large as Argonaut, and they carried the same heavy 6-inch deck guns, but they were true attack submarines rather than mine layers. 6 bow torpedo tubes, long range, large fuel capacity. They had been built as the Navy's first attempt at what would later be called a fleet submarine, a boat that could operate with the surface fleet across the Pacific. The experiment was, again, only partially successful. Narwhal and Nautilus were too big. They took too long to submerge. Their hulls were vulnerable to depth charging. Their diesel engines were underpowered for their displacement. But they were the first American submarines built with the range to cross the Pacific and fight on the other side of it, and that capability alone made them valuable. In September 1939, they were based at Pearl Harbor, training with the fleet. Their 6-inch guns would be used within 3 years to shell Japanese shore installations at Attu in the Aleutians and at Maine in the Gilberts. The 2 boats would have long careers despite their flaws. Dolphin was the reaction to Narwhal and Nautilus. One ship, commissioned in 1932, significantly smaller than the Narwhal class, with 6 torpedo tubes and a single 4-inch deck gun. The Navy had decided that the 2,700-ton fleet submarine was too large, and Dolphin was the experimental reduction, 1,560 tons, 319 feet long. The boat was a compromise. She was better than Narwhal in some ways, worse in others, and the Navy built only one of her. Her class of 1 demonstrated that the American submarine force was still groping for the right size and configuration for a Pacific fleet boat. The bureaucracy could not decide what it wanted. Each new class was an attempt to correct the errors of the previous class, and each new class had errors of its own. Dolphin spent most of her career at Pearl Harbor in reserve and training roles. She would serve in the war as a training boat, never considered fit for combat patrol. She was the last of the experiments before the formula started to come together. The Cachalot class was a further reduction. 2 ships, USS Cachalot and USS Cuttlefish, commissioned in 1933 and 1934. Even smaller than Dolphin, 1130 tons, 271 feet long, 6 torpedo tubes, a single 3-inch gun. The Navy had now built 4 generations of experimental fleet submarines in a decade, each one smaller than the one before, and the Cachalot class was the smallest of them. They were too small, their range was inadequate, their living conditions were intolerable on long patrols, their torpedo reload time was too slow. The Cachalots were decent coastal boats, but they were not fleet submarines in the sense the Navy had been looking for. By September 39, the Navy had concluded that the Cachalot size was wrong, and the design pendulum swung back toward larger hulls. Cachalot and Cuttlefish would serve in the war as training boats, never committed to combat patrols in the forward areas. The Porpoise class was the first American submarine that genuinely worked as a fleet boat. 10 ships, commissioned between 1935 and 1937. USS Porpoise, USS Pike, USS Pike, USS Sark, Shark, USS Tarpon, USS Perch, USS Park, USS Perch, USS Pompano, USS Pompano, USS Pompano, 1,310 tons surfaced, 301 feet long, 6 torpedo tubes, 19 knots on the surface, adequate range and habitability for Pacific patrols. The Porpoise class introduced 2 features that would define every American submarine built afterward: full air conditioning, which made long patrols in tropical waters bearable instead of deadly, and welded hull construction, which was lighter, stronger, and faster to build than the riveted hulls of previous classes. These 2 innovations, boring as they sound, were the breakthrough. American submarines were now habitable for weeks on end in the Pacific, and they could be built quickly in large numbers when the time came. The Porpoise class was the first generation of American boats that the men who designed Japanese anti-submarine warfare would seriously have to worry about. In September 1939, they were distributed across the submarine force, with several based at Manila under the Asiatic Fleet. Their crews were learning the trade that within 3 years would sink more Japanese merchant tonnage than the rest of the American armed forces combined. The Salmon class refined the Porpoise formula. 6 ships, commissioned in 1937 and 1938. USS Salmon, USS Seal, USS Seal, USS Skipjack, USS Snapper, USS Stingray, and USS Sturgeon. They were slightly larger than the Porpoises, 1,435 tons, and they carried 8 torpedo tubes instead of 6, 4 forward and 4 aft. This was a significant increase in firepower. They made 21 knots on the surface, fast enough to run with a carrier task force. Their range allowed patrols of more than a month from Pearl Harbor or Manila. The Salmon-class boats were the ones the submarine officers pointed at when they wanted to show what an American submarine could be. They were not yet perfect. Their torpedoes, as the Navy would discover to its horror in the first year of the war, did not work. The Mark 14 torpedo ran too deep, its magnetic exploder failed, and its contact exploder failed, and its contact exploder failed on impact. The boats were fine. The torpedoes were a disaster. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, the head of the Bureau of Ordnance's torpedo section in the late 1930s, would be the principal defender of the Mark 14 design through the first 2 years of the war, and the controversy would damage his career permanently. But none of that was known in September 39. The Salmon class was, on paper, the most capable submarine type in the American fleet, and her crews believed in her. The Sargo class was the production follow-on to the Salmon. 10 ships, commissioned in 1939 and 1940, USS Sargo, USS Sari, USS Sari, USS Spearfish, USS Sculpin, USS Sailfish, USS Sardfish, USS Sars Regan, USS Sealwolf, ZUS Ear, Sea Regan, USS Sealwolf. They were nearly identical to the Salmon class externally, but incorporated an improved electrical system and revised battery arrangement that increased submerged endurance. Sailfish was a special case. She had been launched in April 1939 under the name USS Squawas. On May 23rd of that year, during her sea trials off Portsmouth, New Hampshire, she had flooded through a failed Maine induction valve during a test dive and sunk in 240 feet of water. 26 men had died in the aft compartments. 33 had survived in the forward compartments, breathing through emergency gear, and the Navy had rescued all of them using a newly developed diving bell called the McCann Rescue Chamber, a revised version of a concept originally developed by Lieutenant Commander Charles Bowers Mommsen and brought to its final working form by Lieutenant Commander Alan Rockwell McCann. It was the first successful submarine rescue in American naval history. The salvage operation that followed was grueling. Squalus was finally raised from the bottom in September 1939, towed into the Portsmouth Navy Yard, and formally decommissioned in November. She would be renamed Sailfish in February 1940 and recommissioned in May 1940, with the name change meant to shed the bad luck of her previous identity. The story of her sinking and rescue had been covered by every newspaper in the country. The American public knew more about submarine operations in the summer of 1939 than at any previous point in history, because of the Squalus. On September 1, 1939, the salvage of Squalus was still ongoing in New Hampshire waters. The rest of the Sargo-class boats were scattered across the submarine force. Several of them, including USS Seawolf and USS Sea Dragon, were assigned to the Asiatic Fleet at Manila. The Tambor class was the design that worked. 6 boats had been laid down in 1939, and none had yet been commissioned on September 1st. USS Tambor, USS Tambor, USS Tautog, USS Trisha, USS Triton, USS Trout, and USS Trot, and USS Tuna. They were slightly larger than the Sargos, with 10 torpedo tubes instead of 8, 6 forward and 4 aft. Their machinery was a refined version of the Sargo plant. Their habitability was improved. Their range was longer. The Tambor class was the first American submarine design that the Bureau of Construction and Repair considered fully mature. Everything that had been learned from the R class, the S class, the Argonaut experiment, the narwhals, the dolphin, the cachalots, the porpoises, the salmons, and the Sargos was poured into the Tambor, and the Tambor would be the starting point for the Gato class, the submarine type the Navy would build by the dozens during the war, the boats that would strangle Japan's merchant marine and starve her home islands of oil, food, and raw materials. The Gatos would be nearly identical to the Tambors, produced on a vastly larger scale. The formula had been found. In September 1939, it was still theoretical, embodied in 6 submarines on the building ways at Electric Boat in Connecticut, at Mare Island in California, and at Portsmouth in New Hampshire. The search for a Pacific Fleet submarine that had consumed American naval architecture for 20 years was over. The Navy had finally built the boat it had been trying to build since the end of the last war. 70 submarines, 9 classes, and a long and painful development history that had produced, by September 1939, exactly the right tool for the war the Navy was about to fight. The American submarine force, taken as a group, had longer range than most submarine fleets then at sea. American boats were designed to cross oceans, not to patrol coasts. That decision, made decades earlier by officers who understood that the next American war would be fought across the Pacific, would turn out to matter more than almost any other choice American naval architecture made between the wars. The submarine force was commanded, in September 1939, by officers whose names were not yet famous. Rear Admiral Thomas Withers commanded the submarines in the Pacific. Captain John Wilkes commanded the Asiatic Fleet submarines at Manila. Charles Lockwood, the officer who would command a Pacific submarine force during the war's most productive years, was still a captain, serving in other billets. The organization was small and tight-knit. Every submarine officer knew every other submarine officer. They were about to become the most effective branch of the United States Navy in the war that was coming. From the submarines, we moved to a category that no other navy in the world counted the same way. The ships that did the unglamorous work, mine warfare, patrol, and the gunboats that were scattered across the rivers and coastal waters of the American colonial empire. 50 ships in 12 classes, most of them old, some of them improvised, a few of them still doing jobs that had been invented in the last century. Below the submarines, below the destroyers, below almost everyone's notice, the United States Navy maintained a category of ships that does not appear in most naval histories of the period. 50 vessels in 12 classes, performing functions that no other major navy organized quite the same way. Mine layers, minesweepers, patrol boats, gunboats on coastal stations, gunboats on Chinese rivers, a converted yacht, a pair of wooden submarine chasers. These ships did the work that the glamour ships did not do. They swept the approaches to harbors. They laid defensive mine barrages. They showed the flag in places the battleships could never reach. They were, in a very real sense, the day-to-day face of the United States Navy in 1939. The working fleet. USS Oglala was one ship older than almost any other commissioned vessel in the American fleet. She had been launched in 1907 as SS Massachusetts, a coastal passenger steamer for the Eastern Steamship Company, working the run between Boston and New York. The Navy had purchased her in 1917 and converted her into a mine layer for the North Sea mine barrage operations of the First World War, that vast and impractical attempt to seal the gap between the Orkneys and Norway against German submarines. She had been renamed Shawmut, and then, in 1928, renamed again to Oglala. By 1939, she was 32 years old, with a promenade deck and the lines of an Edwardian coastal steamer hiding under her military paint. She carried mine rails along her upper decks and could lay a field of 300 mines. She was the flagship of the mine force based at Pearl Harbor, and she would still be there 2 years later, on the morning of December 7, 1941, when a Japanese aerial torpedo would pass under her shallow draft hull and explode against USS Helena moored alongside, and the force of the explosion would rupture Oglala's hull plating. She would capsize pierside. The oldest ship in the fleet would be the first ship lost at Pearl Harbor. But in September 1939, she was afloat, painted, and performing her peacetime function. The Lapwing-class minesweepers were, like the Wickeys and Clemsoney destroyers, a mass production of the last war. 49 had been built between 1918 and 1920, and 22 remained in active service in September 1939. They were small ships, 950 tons, 187 feet long, with a top speed of 14 knots and two 3-inch guns. Their primary mission was to tow paravanes and sweeping gear to cut the mooring cables of moored mines, clearing channels for the fleet. The Lapwings had been used for everything since the last war. Some had been converted to seaplane tenders. Some had been converted to submarine rescue vessels, which you will meet in the auxiliary section. Some had been converted to light mine layers. The ones that remained as minesweepers were scattered across the fleet's bases. They worked the approaches to Pearl Harbor, to Norfolk, to San Diego, to the Philippines. They were old, slow, and entirely suited to a job that did not require speed. The Raven class was the modern replacement for the Lapwings. Two ships, USS Raven and USS Osprey, laid down in 1939 and not yet commissioned on September the 1st. They were steel-hulled, diesel-driven, 810 tons, capable of 18 knots, and designed to keep up with fleet operations rather than operate from a fixed base. They were the first modern American minesweepers since the Lapwings, and they would be the pattern for the much larger wartime minesweeper classes that followed. In September 39, they were both still fitting out. 4 of the flush deck destroyers you met 2 sections ago had been converted to light mine layers. USS Gamble, USS Ramsey, USS Mombury, and USS Breese. They had given up 2 of their forestacks, some of their torpedo tubes, and their aft deckhouse, and gained mine rails and handling gear for about 80 mines. The conversion preserved their 30-plus knot speed, which made them ideal for the mission of laying offensive minefields in enemy coastal waters, an operation that a slow ship could not hope to survive. These 4 conversions, paid for out of a small budget line in the mid-30s, were the Navy's entire offensive mine-laying capability in September 1939. They were based at Pearl Harbor and San Diego. The Eagle class is perhaps the strangest story in the American fleet of 1939. In 1917, facing a serious U-boat threat against Atlantic shipping, the United States Navy had turned to Henry Ford to design a simple, mass-producible submarine chaser. Ford had built a giant assembly hall at his Rouge plant in Detroit, set up automobile-style production lines, and promised to deliver 1 new Eagle boat every day. The target had been 100 ships. 60 had been contracted. The war had ended before most of them were finished. The Eagle boats turned out to be terrible ships. They were too slow for submarine hunting. They were poorly designed for open ocean work. They were cramped and uncomfortable. Ford had built them like cars, and they handled like cars, not like warships. The Navy had taken delivery of 60 of them, and had immediately begun looking for ways to get rid of them. Most had been scrapped or transferred to the Coast Guard by the late 1920s. 8 remained in United States Navy service in September 1939. They were used as gunnery targets, training ships and station vessels at naval reserve bases. They were a reminder of what happened when a democratic wartime procurement system panicked and handed naval ship design to an automobile executive with no relevant experience. Ford's great dream of 1 patrol boat a day had produced 60 expensive curiosities. Most of them were already gone. The 8 that remained were, in a small way, the physical legacy of a very American kind of industrial optimism. The Asheville class was 2 ships, USS Asheville and USS Tulsa. They had been built at the very end of the last war as colonial station gunboats, the kind of ship that every major navy kept in places like the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands and the China coast. 1,575 tons, 241 feet long, 3 4-inch guns, a top speed of 12 knots, which was adequate for showing the flag, but not for fighting a war. They had been built to steam slowly into some colonial harbor, anchor for a few weeks, and then steam slowly somewhere else. Asheville was in the Philippines in September 1939, attached to the Asiatic Fleet. Tulsa was also in Asian waters. The 2 ships were part of the American naval presence in East Asia that, by this date, was becoming increasingly tense. Japanese forces occupied most of coastal China. American gunboats and destroyers were often the only foreign warships on the rivers and in the ports, and their presence was sometimes provocative, sometimes merely awkward. The Erie class was the modern American gunboat, built to replace the aging Asheville's and the even older colonial hulls. 2 ships, USS Erie and USS Charleston, commissioned in 1936. They were much larger than the Asheville's, 2,000 tons, 308 feet long, with 4 6-inch guns and an extraordinary cruising range of 20,000 nautical miles. They had been built to cross oceans without refueling, a requirement that made sense for ships intended to patrol vast colonial coastlines. They were, in effect, miniature cruisers. Both ships were in the Caribbean in September 1939, working the neutrality patrol. Their long range made them ideal for the job, which involved weeks at sea watching for belligerent vessels in American coastal waters. The Eries were not glamorous ships. They were not fast. They were not heavily armored. They were, within a very narrow specification, exactly what they had been designed to be. USS Sacramento was 1 ship, commissioned in 1914, older than most of the destroyers she served alongside. She had been built specifically for the China station, with a shallow draft for coastal work and a design that echoed the older colonial gunboats of the Royal Navy and the French Navy. 1,425 tons. 3 4-inch guns, 12 knots. In September 1939, she was 25 years old and still on Asian station, operating from Cavite in the Philippines and making occasional port calls to Shanghai and Hong Kong. She was a survival of the pre-war colonial world, a ship of a type that would essentially cease to exist after 1945. The river gunboats of the Yangtze Patrol were perhaps the most unusual category of warship in the United States Navy. The Guam class was 2 of them, USS Guam and USS Tutuila. Commissioned in 1927, they had been built at Qiannan Dock in Shanghai using American money and American designs, but Chinese labor and Chinese facilities. They displaced only 560 tons. They were 159 feet long. Their draft was less than 6 feet. They carried 2 3-inch guns and a handful of light machine guns. Their purpose was to patrol the Yangtze River, protecting American missionaries, businessmen, and commercial interests in the Chinese interior. The United States, along with Britain, France, Japan, and Italy, maintained a gunboat presence on the Yangtze under the various treaties negotiated after the Boxer Rebellion. American gunboats went as far upriver as Chongqing, more than 1,000 miles from the sea. The Yangtze Patrol was a world of its own, with its own customs, its own language, and its own hierarchy of respect. Officers who had served on the river spoke of it with the same reverence that European officers of an earlier generation had used when speaking of India. By September 1939, the Chinese mainland was largely under Japanese control. The Yangtze Patrol was operating in what was effectively Japanese-occupied territory, and its movements were subject to Japanese interference. The situation was delicate. It had, on at least one previous occasion, been catastrophic. The Luzon class was 3 more Yangtze River gunboats, USS Luzon, USS Mindanao, and USS Iwahoo, all built at Qiannan Dock in Shanghai and commissioned in 1928. They were slightly larger than the Guam's, 210 feet long, with the same 560-ton displacement and the same 2 3-inch guns. They had the flat bottoms, shallow drafts, and stern paddle-like arrangements necessary for river work. There had been a 4th ship in the Luzon group, USS Panay, a small gunboat built to a related design, commissioned in 1928. On December 12, 1937, Panay had been steaming up the Yangtze, evacuating American diplomatic personnel from Nanking ahead of the advancing Japanese army. Japanese naval aircraft had attacked her without warning, strafing and bombing the clearly marked American warship for nearly an hour. 3 Americans had been killed. 48 had been wounded. Panay had sunk in the river. The incident had nearly caused war between the United States and Japan. Japan had apologized, paid an indemnity of $2 million, and promised to discipline the officers responsible. The incident had been covered by American newsreels using film shot by Universal newsreel cameramen who had been aboard Panay at the time of the attack. The American public had seen, on movie theater screens, a Japanese attack on an American warship and the resulting deaths of American sailors. The year was 1937. 4 years would pass before the public would see anything comparable happen at Pearl Harbor, and the response to Panay both in Washington and in the country at large had been to pay the indemnity, accept the apology, and continue the policy of neutrality. The memory of Panay hung heavily over the Luzon-class ships that remained on the Yangtze 2 years later. USS Isabel was a single ship, and she was technically a patrol yacht. She had been built in 1917 as a private yacht for John North Willis, the founder of the Willis Overland Automobile Company. The Navy had purchased her during the First World War and commissioned her as a patrol vessel, 710 tons, 243 feet long, a high-speed yacht hull with a single 3-inch gun and a dispatch boat roll. By 1939, Isabel had been in commission for 22 years. She was assigned to the Asiatic Fleet, serving as the flagship's dispatch vessel and general-purpose courier. She carried admirals and their staffs between Manila and various ports in the South China Sea. She was, in effect, a floating office with a gun on the bow. Her role was mostly ceremonial, but she was a commissioned warship of the United States Navy, and her presence added to the strange inventory of the Asiatic fleet. At the very bottom of the warship inventory were two small experimental submarine chasers of the SC-449 type, laid down in the summer of 1939 under the fiscal year 1938 program. 110 feet long, wooden construction, a light 3-inch gun, and depth charges. They were direct descendants of the First World War submarine chaser design, revived at the personal insistence of Franklin Roosevelt, who as Assistant Secretary of the Navy 2 decades earlier had helped push the original wartime program through. They were not serious combatants. They were experimental prototypes meant to refine a design that could be mass-produced if a major anti-submarine effort became necessary. Within 3 years, hundreds of similar small chasers would be building at yards all over the country. The SC-497 class of over 400 hulls that would patrol American and Allied coastal waters throughout the war. But on September 1, 1939, only the 2 prototypes existed, both still under construction, and the mass production they would eventually make possible had not yet been authorized. 50 ships, 12 classes. The mine force, the patrol force, the gunboats on the rivers and the coasts. A category of warship that no modern navy really maintains in peacetime, because peacetime navies are built around big ships, and the small working craft are always there in the margins, doing the jobs that nobody photographs. These were the ships that kept the empire functioning. The gunboats on the Yangtze, the minesweeper at Pearl Harbor, the patrol yacht carrying an admiral's signal flags across the South China Sea, the former coastal steamer laying mines off Oahu, the old destroyers with their mine rails replacing their torpedo tubes. They were not the future of the United States Navy. The future, arguably, had already been built somewhere else in the fleet. In the Yorktown-class carriers, in the Brooklyn cruisers, in the Tambor submarines, in the hull skeletons of North Carolina and South Dakota. These small ships were the past. They were what the Navy had always done. In peace, in every major navy, in every ocean. They were also the ones that showed what the United States Navy actually looked like on the 1st of September 1939. Not in the battle line at sea, not in the carrier task force, but at a pier in Manila, or a station in Shanghai, or a buoy in Pearl Harbor, doing the routine work of a peacetime fleet. Behind them, finally, stood the ships that made all of it possible. The ships whose names almost no American civilian knew, whose tonnage was the largest single category in the fleet, and whose role in the war that was coming would decide the entire Pacific campaign. The Auxiliaries. 90 ships in 22 types, the logistical spine of the United States Navy. The last category of the United States Navy in September 1939 is the one that almost every naval history of the period treats as an afterthought. 90 ships divided into 22 types, making up nearly a quarter of the fleet by hull count. Oilers, tenders, tugs, hospital ships, ammunition carriers, repair ships, stores ships, seaplane tenders, submarine rescue vessels. The ships that carried fuel, spare parts, ammunition, food, medical supplies, aircraft, torpedoes, and the crews to maintain all of it. In peacetime, they were invisible. In wartime, they would be the reason the American fleet could operate across the Pacific Ocean, when no other navy in history had ever tried. This is the part of the American fleet that the Imperial Japanese Navy never matched. Japan in 1939 had magnificent battleships, excellent cruisers, formidable destroyers, and well-trained submarine crews. What Japan did not have, in anything like the same proportion, was an auxiliary fleet built for sustained operations thousands of miles from home. Japan had assumed that her warships would fight close to her own waters. The United States Navy had assumed the opposite, and the United States Navy had built the ships that would make fighting 10,000 miles from home possible. The men who chose to build these ships, in a democracy that had to be argued into paying for them, understood something that most of the professional militaries of Europe and Asia underweighted. You cannot win a naval war without a fleet train, and a fleet train, like a battle line, takes 20 years to build. USS Nitro was one ship, a single ammunition carrier, and she was essentially the entire American fleet ammunition capacity in September 1939. Built at the end of the First World War as a converted merchant hull, 382 feet long, capable of 11 knots, her holds were fitted with magazines, elevators, and handling gear for transferring shells and powder to warships at anchor. She sailed from ammunition depot to fleet anchorage and back again, a slow, dangerous, boring ship doing work that absolutely had to be done. If a capital ship fired off its magazines in a fleet exercise, Nitro was the ship that reloaded her. There was no second ship in her role. 3 converted merchant ships made up the Navy's entire fleet cargo lift capacity. They were old, they were slow, and they had been taken over from commercial service at the end of the last war. Their role was to carry general cargo for the fleet, from stateside depots to the forward bases at Pearl Harbor, San Diego, Panama, and Manila. 3 ships, for a Navy with 408 combatants spread across 2 oceans. The disproportion would have been alarming to any admiral who thought hard about it. Most of them did not think about it. That was the problem. The older destroyer tenders were a mix of hulls dating from before and during the First World War, 6 of them in commission in September 1939. USS Melville, USS Dobbin, USS Whitney, USS Blackhawk, USS Altair, and USS Dinibola. They ranged from 6,000 to 10,000 tons. Their purpose was to support a squadron of destroyers at anchor, providing machine shops, torpedo workshops, spare parts, fresh provisions, and crew accommodations when a ship was being overhauled. Every major destroyer anchorage in the Navy had at least one tender assigned to it. Without the tenders, the destroyers could not operate. Small ships with small crews and limited internal space could not carry the workshops and repair facilities they needed. The tenders carried them instead. USS Dixie was a single ship under construction in September 1939, the lead ship of what would become a class of large purpose-built destroyer tenders for the wartime Navy. She was being built at New York Shipbuilding in Camden, New Jersey. She would be commissioned in April 1940. She represented a new generation of auxiliary ship designed from the keel up for her mission rather than converted from a merchant hull. 18.5 knots, fast enough to keep up with a destroyer squadron on the move. Extensive repair shops, magazines for torpedoes and ammunition. The Dixie class would eventually number 5 ships, all built during the war. Ardod 1 was a floating dry dock, not a ship in the conventional sense. She had no engines, no crew quarters for ocean passage, no ability to move under her own power. She was a large sectional structure that could be towed to a forward base, sunk by flooding her ballast tanks, and then used to lift a destroyer or a submarine clear of the water for repairs. She had been built in 1934 as an experimental design, and she had proved successful enough that more would be built. In September 1939, ARD-1 was the only mobile dry dock in the Navy. Within 5 years, there would be dozens of them, spread across the Pacific, repairing damaged ships at Ulithi and Manison, Majuro. The concept was revolutionary, the ability to repair a ship at a forward base, rather than sending her all the way back to a mainland yard, added months of combat availability to every ship in the fleet. The British had the idea first. The Americans industrialized it. USS Relief was the Navy's only hospital ship. She had been commissioned in 1920 as the first American ship ever designed from the keel up as a hospital ship, rather than converted from a passenger liner. 10,000 tons full load, 483 feet long. She could carry 500 patients with operating rooms, X-ray facilities, dental clinics, a full laboratory, and a permanent medical staff. In September 1939, she was based at San Pedro, California, Attached to the battle force, she was painted white with the red crosses and green stripes required by the Geneva Convention. 13 ships fell into the catch-all category of miscellaneous auxiliaries. They were converted from everything imaginable: former destroyers, former yachts, former Coast Guard cutters. One of them, USS Utah, was a former battleship of the Florida class, demilitarized under the London Treaty and rebuilt as a radio-controlled gunnery target for the fleet. Utah was used to train naval gunners in attacks on a maneuvering battleship. Her guns removed, her bridge automated. She carried wooden platforms over her decks to protect her plating from dummy bomb hits. The other 12 were training ships, dispatch vessels, station ships, and various other odds and ends. They were the archaeological layers of the American Navy, preserved in commission because they still served some purpose and the Navy did not have the budget to replace them. 17 ocean-going tugs made up most of the Navy's towing and salvage capacity. They had been built during the First World War to tow damaged warships and support fleet operations. By 1939, they were old but still working. They were based at every major fleet anchorage. They towed targets for gunnery practice. They moved barges and lighters. They responded to groundings and collisions. They were the ship-handling equivalent of dock workers, unglamorous and indispensable. The Navajo class was the modern replacement. 3 ships, USS Navajo, USS Seminole, and USS Cherokee, laid down in 1939 and not yet commissioned on September 1st. They were 1,235 tons, 205 feet long, 16.5 knots, diesel-electric drive, which gave them fine control at low speeds for delicate ship-handling work. They were the first modern American fleet tugs since the last war. The class would eventually grow to nearly 20 ships by 1945. The fleet oilers were, without much argument, the single most important category of auxiliary in the American Navy. 8 older oilers were in service in September 1939. They ranged from 5,000 to 14,000 tons. They were old, slow, and collectively inadequate for the fleet they supported. Without them, no American warship could operate more than a few thousand miles from a shore-based fuel depot. With them, the fleet could, in theory, cross the Pacific. In practice, 8 old oilers were nowhere near enough, and the Navy knew it. The Cimarron class changed everything. 2 ships had been commissioned in the spring and summer of 1939, with more under construction and about to follow. USS Cimarron had entered service in March. USS Neosho had been commissioned in August, just weeks before the war began in Europe. USS Platte, the third of the class, would follow in December. They had been built under a Maritime Commission subsidy program, with the stipulation that they would be available to the Navy in time of war. They were huge, 25,000 tons full load, 553 feet long, 18 knots, fast enough to keep up with a fleet task force. They carried more than 100,000 barrels of fuel oil, plus aviation gasoline, plus diesel fuel. They had the modern underway replenishment equipment that allowed them to refuel a warship while both ships were steaming at 15 knots. The Cimarron class was the breakthrough. These were the oilers that would make the Pacific campaign possible. Before the war was over, more than 20 Cimarrons would be built, and every major American fleet action from Guadalcanal to Okinawa would be fueled from their tanks. The concept of mobile logistics at sea, the underway replenishment group, the fleet train that followed the battle fleet across the ocean, all of it would be built around Cimarrons. In September 39, 2 of them were in service. They were working up with the fleet, developing the techniques that would later be codified into doctrine. They were the single most important ships in the United States Navy that the American public had never heard of. 2 repair ships were in commission, USS Medusa and USS Vestal. They were floating factories with machine shops that could rebuild a cruiser's engine or repair a battleship's turret. Vestal would become famous 2 years later when she was moored alongside USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. She would be hit by Japanese bombs and survive. Arizona would not. But in September 39, Vestal and Medusa were routine assets of the fleet, doing work that would otherwise have required a ship to be sent back to a navy yard on the mainland. USS Langley was the most historically significant ship in the auxiliary fleet. She had been commissioned in 1922 as the first aircraft carrier in the United States Navy, converted from the collier USS Jupiter. She had been the ship that taught the Navy how to operate aircraft from a flight deck. In 1936, with the Lexington, Saratoga, and Ranger in service and the Yorktowns on the way, Langley had been converted back into a seaplane tender. Half her flight deck had been removed. Hangars had been built over her forward decks for patrol aircraft. She was now assigned to the Asiatic Fleet, based at Cavite in the Philippines, supporting patrol squadrons operating Catalina flying boats over the South China Sea. USS Wright was the second ship in this category, a purpose-built seaplane tender from 1921. Together they represented the old generation of aviation support ships, converted from other purposes or designed before the modern seaplane tender concept had matured. The Curtis class was the modern answer. Two ships, USS Curtis and USS Albemarle, laid down in 1939 and not yet commissioned. They were 8,600 tons, 527 feet long, 20 knots. They were designed specifically as seaplane tenders for long-range patrol aircraft, with full aviation workshops, fuel storage, ordnance magazines, and the berthing and messing to support a patrol squadron away from any shore facility. Curtis took her name from Glenn Curtis, the aircraft designer whose pusher biplanes had carried naval aviators on the first shipboard takeoffs and landings a generation earlier. Albemarle took her name in the traditional Navy pattern for seaplane tenders. From Albemarle Sound on the North Carolina coast, the ships would be commissioned in 1940 and 1941. 11 small seaplane tenders made up the rest of the aviation support force. They were converted Lapwing-class minesweepers, mostly, or old destroyer hulls, fitted with aviation workshops and small seaplane handling cranes. They served as forward support vessels, following patrol aircraft squadrons to remote anchorages where a full-size tender could not operate. They were small, slow, and individually unimportant, but collectively they extended the reach of American patrol aviation across the Pacific to islands and atolls that would otherwise have had no naval presence at all. Two stores ships, both converted merchant hulls dating from before the First World War, carried refrigerated and dry stores for the fleet. They were the supermarkets of the Navy, moving fresh meat, vegetables, dairy, and dry goods to anchorages and bases. Two ships for 408 warships, another disproportion that the planners knew about and that the budget would not yet fix. 5 submarine rescue vessels were in commission. They had been converted from Lapwing-class minesweeper hulls with additional diving gear, salvage equipment, and, most critically, the McCann rescue chamber that Lieutenant Commander Mommsen had pioneered. The squalor's rescue of May 1939 had been carried out by USS Falcon, one of these vessels. The operation had worked. The McCann chamber had saved 33 lives. All 5 submarine rescue vessels in the fleet carried similar equipment, stationed at the major submarine bases to respond to any accident that might occur on the surface or in shallow water. 5 submarine tenders provided the floating support bases for the submarine force: USS Beaver, USS Canopus, USS Colin, USS Bushnell, and USS Camden. Their role was identical to that of the destroyer tenders, but adapted for the specialized needs of submarines: torpedo shops, battery repair facilities, diesel engine workshops, medical facilities for decompression injuries. Most importantly, stable moored bases where submarine crews could rest between patrols, sleeping in actual bunks rather than in the cramped interiors of their boats. Canopus was stationed at Manila, supporting the Asiatic Fleet submarines. The others were in the Pacific and Atlantic, wherever submarine squadrons operated. USS Fulton was the modern purpose-built submarine tender laid down in 1939 and not yet commissioned. She would be commissioned in September 1941, 12 weeks before Pearl Harbor. She was 9,200 tons, 530 feet long, 18 knots. She carried the workshops and stores to support a full submarine squadron at any forward anchorage in the Pacific, and her class, like the Dixie-class destroyer tenders, would be the foundation of the wartime tender force. She was named for Robert Fulton, the engineer who had designed the first practical steamship and whose submarine experiments had predated the Civil War by half a century. 2 transports were in Navy commission. They were former passenger liners or Army transports, taken over during or after the First World War, used for moving Marine Corps units between Caribbean and Pacific stations. They were old, slow, and not particularly well suited to their role, but the Army operated most of the American overseas transport capacity, and the Navy's 2 ships were essentially specialized assets for Marine Corps needs. Finally, at the very bottom of the inventory, one ship that did not quite fit any category. USS Dubuque had been commissioned in 1904 as a gunboat, 35 years old, 1,085 tons, 200 feet long, 12 knots. By 1939, she was classified as unclassified, an administrative term meaning that she no longer fit any active combatant role, but had not yet been struck from the register. She was used for training cruises out of the Great Lakes Naval Training Center, teaching midshipmen and apprentice seamen the basics of shipboard life. She was, in a sense, the oldest commissioned warship in the active Navy. Her presence in the list is a reminder of how the American Navy accumulated ships across decades, keeping old hulls alive for marginal purposes because the alternative, scrapping them, cost money that the appropriations never quite provided. 90 auxiliaries, 22 types, the logistical spine of the United States Navy, the ships that fueled the fleet, fed it, repaired it, rescued its submariners, tended its seaplanes, and carried its ammunition. Many of them were old. Many of them had been built during the First World War. Many of them had been acquired as converted merchant hulls rather than purpose-built warships. The auxiliary fleet, more than any other category, showed the scars of the long years of peacetime neglect, but the new ships were beginning to arrive. Cimarron-class oilers, 3 in commission with more building, Dixie-class destroyer tenders, Curtiss-class seaplane tenders, Fulton-class submarine tenders, Navajo-class fleet tugs. Each of them was the lead ship of a class that would grow to 5, 10, 20, 50 vessels by the end of the war. The Navy had understood, perhaps earlier than most observers realized, that the auxiliary fleet would be the single most important investment in any coming naval war. It had been, until 1939, the category of ship that was easiest to cut when budgets got tight. It was the first category that would be massively expanded when the budget constraints finally disappeared. And the budget constraints were about to disappear. Not on September 1st, 1939. That day only started the war in Europe. The budget constraints would disappear in pieces. A supplemental appropriation here, an emergency program there, the 2 Ocean Navy Act of 1940, the Lend-Lease program of 1941. And finally, the morning of December 7th, 1941, when the last excuse for restraint evaporated. Those events were in the future. In September 39, the Navy had what it had. 408 ships spread across every ocean and every role, old and new and unfinished, scattered from the Yangtze to the Caribbean, commanded by officers whose names would be famous in 3 years and unknown in 5. The United States fleet of 1939, the fleet of a democracy that had built it slowly. Now, finally, the accounting of what all of it meant. 408 ships, 76 classes, 19 battleships, 6 aircraft carriers, 37 cruisers, 136 destroyers, 70 submarines, 50 mine warfare and patrol and gunboat vessels, 90 auxiliaries. A fleet that stretched from the Yangtze River to the coast of Maine, from Pearl Harbor to the Panama Canal Zone, from Cavite to Casco Bay. On paper, one of the largest naval forces on Earth. In the cold mathematics of tonnage and hull counts, almost certainly the largest. In actual capability, in the ability to fight a modern naval war against a first-class opponent, the United States Navy of September 1, 1939 was not ready. 15 of its battleships had been commissioned before the end of the last war. 4 more were on the building ways, none less than 2 years from completion. The 6 aircraft carriers had been built as experiments, compromises or treaty leftovers, and no senior officer outside a small group of aviation advocates believed that the carrier would decide the next war. The 18 heavy cruisers had been designed around the 10,000-ton arms control limit and carried the weaknesses of that compromise in their armor schemes. 48 of the destroyers dated from 1918 and 1919. 32 of the 70 submarines were worn-out training boats from the last war. The 8 fleet oilers on which the entire concept of trans-Pacific operations depended were mostly old and slow, and only 3 modern Submarines had so far entered service. This was not the fault of the Navy. The Navy had known what was coming. The Navy had drawn up plans, developed doctrine, and trained its officers for a Pacific war against Japan throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. War Plan Orange had been studied, revised, war-gamed, and rehearsed in fleet exercises year after year. The intellectual preparation had been thorough. What had been missing was the physical preparation. The ships, the crews, the ammunition, the infrastructure, the shipyards running at capacity. All of it required money, and all of the money required votes, and the votes had never quite been there. This was the paradox that defined the American fleet of 1939. The United States was the largest industrial economy in the world. Her steel production in 1939 exceeded the combined output of Germany, Britain, and Japan. Her shipyards, from Bath Iron Works in Maine to Mare Island in San Francisco Bay, had capacities sitting idle. Her naval architects had drawings ready for battleships, carriers, and cruisers better than anything afloat. Her engineers, her welders, her machinists, her electricians, her tool and die makers numbered in the millions. The raw material of naval power, in every dimension that mattered, was more abundant in the United States than anywhere else on Earth. And yet, the American Navy, on the day the war began in Europe, was building exactly 4 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, a handful of cruisers, and a relatively small number of destroyers and submarines. The building programs had been expanded under the Vinson-Trammell Act of 1934 and again under the Second Vinson Act of 1938, and each expansion had been hard-fought, argued over line by line in House and Senate committees, with every appropriation measured against competing demands for schools, highways, hospitals, relief programs, and agricultural subsidies. The NIA Committee had declared in 1936 that American participation in the First World War had been driven by arms manufacturers and Wall Street bankers. 52% of Americans, polled in early 1939, believed that American involvement in any future European war would be a mistake. The Neutrality Acts, 4 of them since 1935, were the legal expression of that opinion. In that environment, the Navy could not ask for what it needed. The Navy had to ask for what it could get. It had to justify its ships as economic stimulus, as jobs programs, as improvements to merchant marine capacity. It had to build them slowly, over years, through appropriations bills that were reopened and amended and cut. It had to accept that its newest battleships would be under construction for 4 years, and that its newest submarines would be built in batches of 6 or 10, rather than in the dozens the service knew it would eventually need. This was not dysfunction. This was democracy. This was what it meant for a country to build its fleet through the consent of its citizens. rather than through the decrees of a government that did not have to ask. Japan had built the Yamato class in secret, outside the treaty limits, funded by a national budget that the Japanese public could not vote on. Germany had rebuilt its navy in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, approved by a dictator who did not have to argue his case. The United States had built its fleet one vote at a time, and the fleet that resulted was the fleet that American voters had been willing to pay for. That fleet, in September 39, was not enough. It would become enough. The process by which it became enough is one of the great stories of the 20th century. But it is not this story. What happened between September 1st, 1939 and August 15th, 1945 was that the American shipbuilding industry, released from the political constraints that had held it back for 20 years, built ships faster than any industrial base in human history has ever built anything. 2,700 Liberty ships, 147 aircraft carriers of all types, 8 battleships, 46 cruisers, 349 destroyers, 201 submarines, tens of thousands of landing craft, patrol boats, auxiliaries, and support vessels. The American naval expansion between Pearl Harbor and VJ Day produced more ship tonnage than the entire world had produced in the previous 40 years combined. None of that was visible on the morning of September 1st, 1939. On that morning, the United States Navy was what it had been. 408 ships, an old fleet, a patchwork fleet, a fleet that showed the long peace in every plate of its hulls. At the top of it sat Admiral Stark, 1 month into his job, reading the wire reports from Poland. Somewhere in the White House, Franklin Roosevelt was preparing the orders for the Neutrality Patrol, the diplomatic fig leaf that would put American warships on an Atlantic picket line watching for German raiders. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Block's flagship Pennsylvania was at a battleship mooring, her crew going about routine morning duties. In the Philippines, Admiral Hart's Asiatic fleet was preparing for what everyone understood would soon be a war. On the Yangtze, the river gunboats, Luzon and Mindanao, and Guam and Oahu were moored at Shanghai, surrounded by Japanese forces watching. At Norfolk, Enterprise was loading stores for a routine deployment. At New York Navy Yard, the skeleton of North Carolina rose above the building ways, still a year from launching. The sleeping giant was sleeping. The sleeping giant had been kept asleep by 1,000 individual democratic decisions, each one defensible, each one reasonable, each one made by voters and legislators and presidents who had their own priorities and their own constituents and their own understanding of what the country needed. The sleeping giant would be woken up eventually by an attack that no one in September 39 could quite bring themselves to imagine, although many of them, in their professional assessments, understood that it was coming. When the giant woke up, he would build a fleet. Not this fleet, a different fleet. A fleet of ships that had not yet been drawn, ships whose designers were still junior officers in the Bureau of Construction and Repair, ships whose steel was still iron ore in the hills of Minnesota. The giant's fleet would be so large that it would make the Navy of September 39 look like a coastal flotilla by comparison. The giant's fleet would cross the Pacific, sink the Imperial Japanese Navy, blockade the Japanese home islands, and end the war in a harbor in Tokyo Bay that most of the officers who commanded ships in September 39 would never live to see. But all of that was ahead. On September the 1st, 1939, the giant was sleeping. The fleet you have just seen, class by class, ship by ship, old and new and half-built, was the fleet he was sleeping with. It was the fleet that a democracy had built, one vote at a time, over 2 decades of peace. It was not the fleet that would win the war. It was the fleet that would hold the line until the real fleet arrived. 408 ships, 76 classes. The United States Navy of September 1st, 1939. The fleet of the sleeping giant.